Elijah Carter stood in front of the grand, whitewashed gallery, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped the leather strap of his portfolio case. The prestigious building gleamed in the morning light, casting a brilliant reflection of the city skyline across its polished glass facade. This was it, the moment he had been working for his entire life. Inside, the gallery was a world of silent reverence, an immaculate space where art was more than just decoration. It was a commodity, a symbol of wealth and status. For years, Elijah had dreamt of seeing his own work hanging on those pristine walls, alongside the famous names of contemporary art. He had painted for hours, poured his soul onto each canvas, believing that one day, someone would recognize the depth of his vision. But despite all his efforts, his path had been anything but easy. His art, deeply rooted in his experiences as a black man growing up in a world that often overlooked his existence, was unlike anything the mainstream art world seemed to value. His paintings weren't just abstract splashes of color or minimalist statements, they told stories of struggle, of heritage, of pride, and, above all, they celebrated the richness of black culture and identity. Each stroke of the brush carried the weight of history and the dream of a future where his voice would be heard. But for now, Elijah's world was one of rejection. He had sent his portfolio to countless galleries, but each time, the response was the same, a polite decline, a quick glance at his work, and an unspoken implication that his art wasn't suited for the refined tastes of their collectors. It was a crushing cycle, one that threatened to crush his spirit with every rejection. Yet, today, Elijah had decided, was different. This time, he was going to the Leclerc Gallery, one of the most renowned in the city. If any place could change his life, it was this gallery. Located in the heart of the city's bustling arts district, the gallery was a temple of exclusivity. The works on its walls were the creations of household names, artists whose pieces sold for millions at auction, whose names were whispered in awe at elite gatherings. And, perhaps most importantly, the gallery catered to a high-class clientele, people with influence, taste, and deep pockets. But Elijah wasn't just here to sell his art, he was here to prove a point. His work deserved a place on these walls, alongside the world's finest. He wasn't going to be dismissed because of his background or the color of his skin. No, Elijah had talent, he had stories to tell, and he was determined to make the world see it. The gallery's interior was exactly as he had imagined, white walls, sleek wood floors, and soft lighting that bathed the artwork in an almost reverential glow. The place felt sterile, clinical even, like an art museum designed more for display than for emotion. In the far corner of the space, behind a polished desk stacked with papers and receipts, sat Victor Leclerc, the gallery's owner. Elijah had done his research. Victor was known for his cutthroat nature and his discerning eye for art. People said that if Victor didn't approve of your work, you'd be better off throwing your dreams away. But Elijah had come prepared. His portfolio was full of his finest pieces, each one a masterpiece in its own right. Victor didn't look up as Elijah approached. The man was tall, sharp-featured, with a white shirt that gleamed too brightly against his deep tan. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and his narrow eyes seemed to look right through Elijah, as if he was already judging him before a word was spoken. "Excuse me," Elijah said, clearing his throat. His voice was steady, though his heart raced in his chest. "I'm Elijah Carter. I'd like to show you my work. I believe it's a good fit for your gallery." Victor's gaze flicked up for a brief moment, dismissing Elijah with a flick of his wrist, before turning back to his desk. "I'm busy," he muttered, his voice cold and uninterested. Elijah stood there for a moment, wondering if he should leave, if it was even worth trying. But something inside him refused to back down. He had come this far, hadn't he? His dream was too big to be stifled by a single rude encounter. With a deep breath, Elijah walked around the desk, setting his portfolio case down in front of Victor. "I understand you're busy," Elijah said, maintaining his composure, "but I've traveled a long way to show you something I believe is worth your time." Victor finally looked up again, his lips curling in a faint, condescending smile. "Very well," he said, a bored note creeping into his voice. "Show me what you've got." Elijah opened the case slowly, revealing the first of his paintings. It was a bold, colorful piece that depicted a figure, a woman, strong and resolute, standing amidst swirling patterns of red, yellow, and black. Her eyes, painted with an intensity that seemed almost alive, locked with the viewer's gaze, challenging them to look beyond the surface. It was a piece that captured the complexity of Black womanhood, the pain and the pride of living in a world that often ignored or belittled you. Victor didn't flinch. He simply glanced at it for a second, then flipped the page to the next. Elijah's heart sank a little as he watched Victor skim through his work, barely acknowledging the effort he had put into each piece. "This is fine," Victor said dismissively, not even taking the time to fully look at the next painting. "But it's too personal. Too niche. No one is going to buy this. It's not the kind of thing collectors are looking for." Elijah swallowed hard. He had expected something, perhaps a critique, but not this cold dismissal of everything he had worked so hard for. "Personal?" Elijah repeated, trying to maintain his calm. "Art is personal. It's meant to speak to the soul, to connect with people on a deeper level." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. No. Art is a business. You need to understand that. This," he gestured at the portfolio, as though it were something insignificant, "is too rooted in your background, your culture. It won't sell. It's not the kind of thing the market wants. You're better off focusing on something less specific." Elijah felt the sting of the words deep within him. They were words he had heard before, but never with such finality. He had heard them from other gallery owners, from critics, from people who didn't understand that his art wasn't meant to be trendy or easily digestible. His art wasn't meant for everyone. But that didn't mean it didn't have value. He closed his portfolio slowly, his fingers brushing over the edges of the pages. "Thank you for your time," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady, despite the turmoil rising inside him. "But I believe you're wrong. My art has a place in the world. And one day, people will see it." Victor didn't even look up as Elijah turned to leave. He had already dismissed him, mentally crossing him off as another failed artist who didn't understand the true nature of the art world. But Elijah knew better. Outside, the cool air of the city hit him like a wave, but it didn't bring the relief he had hoped for. His steps felt heavy as he walked away from the gallery, each one echoing the weight of his failure. He couldn't help but wonder, was Victor right? Was his art really too much of a niche? But then, as quickly as the doubt crept in, it was replaced by a new sense of resolve. He wasn't going to let one man's narrow vision define his future. His art was worth something. It had to be. And if no one else could see it now, then it was only a matter of time before they did. Elijah didn't know it yet, but his journey had only just begun. It was abstract, a mix of bold geometric shapes and wild, vibrant colors, but there was something about it that felt more confident, more sure of itself. He was sitting at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, when his phone buzzed on the table beside him. At first, he ignored it, not in the mood to talk to anyone. But when the notification caught his eye, his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from an art dealer he'd sent his work to months ago, a man named Roland Masters, one of the most influential private art collectors in the world. The message was simple, but full of promise. "Your work is unlike anything I've seen in a long time. I'd like to discuss a potential acquisition." Elijah's hand shook as he read the words over and over again. He felt a rush of excitement flood through him, mixed with disbelief. Roland Masters was a collector whose name commanded respect in the art world. If he was reaching out to Elijah, it meant something. It meant that someone, finally, saw the value in what Elijah had been creating all these years. That night, Elijah could hardly sleep, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this be the breakthrough he had been waiting for? What if this was his chance to prove everyone wrong, especially Victor Leclerc? The next morning, Elijah reached out to Roland, agreeing to meet in person at the collector's private gallery. When the day finally arrived, Elijah's nerves were palpable. He dressed carefully, his clothes weren't expensive, but they were neat and presentable. He took extra time to ensure that his portfolio was in perfect condition, each painting carefully arranged and protected. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. As he stepped into Roland's private gallery, the difference between the Leclerc gallery and this space was immediate. Where Victor's gallery had felt cold, commercial, and sterile, Roland's was warm and inviting, with low lighting and plush carpeting. The walls were lined with pieces from famous contemporary artists, but there was something more intimate about the space, as though the art was meant to be experienced, not just observed. Roland greeted him with a warm handshake and a smile that put him at ease. "Elijah, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard quite a bit about your work." Elijah had expected the usual polite pleasantries, but Roland's eyes shone with genuine interest. He led Elijah through the gallery, taking the time to examine each piece in detail, asking insightful questions that made Elijah feel seen and respected. When they finally reached the last painting in his portfolio, a piece that depicted a black woman standing strong in front of a stormy sky, her face filled with determination, Roland stopped. He studied it for a long time, his gaze never wavering. "This piece," Roland said softly, "is extraordinary. It tells a story. It's not just art, it's a statement. A message. And I believe it needs to be shared with the world." Elijah stood on the steps of the Leclerc gallery, the cold bite of the wind stinging his face as he tried to gather his thoughts. His fingers still tingled from the brief contact with the portfolio, the weight of Victor's dismissive words pressing down on him like an invisible hand. Too personal, too niche. The phrase echoed in his mind, and with every repetition, the bitterness of the rejection grew stronger. How could someone with such power in the art world, someone whose job was to recognize talent, fail to see what was so clearly in front of him? But Elijah knew the reality. Victor Leclerc was not just a man of taste and influence, he was a gatekeeper. He wasn't interested in art that didn't serve his market, art that told the stories of people who weren't already part of the elite circle of buyers and collectors. Elijah's work, deeply personal and grounded in his lived experiences, simply didn't fit the mold of the commercial art world. And that, it seemed, was all that mattered. As Elijah walked away from the gallery, he forced himself to take deep breaths. He needed to clear his head, to let go of the crushing weight of disappointment before it could consume him. He had no intention of letting this moment define him. He was a good artist, no, more than that, he was a great artist. His work had meaning, and that meaning mattered more than the fleeting approval of someone like Victor. The next few days were a blur of mixed emotions. Elijah tried to stay focused, to keep painting, but the sting of that meeting lingered. He couldn't escape it. Every time he picked up his brush, every time he studied a new canvas, his mind wandered back to Victor's words. He knew he had to move past this rejection, but it wasn't easy. The art world was brutal, and the more he learned about it, the more he realized just how narrow and unforgiving it could be. To distract himself, Elijah went to his studio, a small, cluttered space in a building that had once been a factory. The walls were lined with unfinished canvases, half-finished works, and scraps of old paintings he'd abandoned years ago. It was here, in this chaotic sanctuary, that Elijah could lose himself in his art, where the world outside didn't matter. His brushes moved feverishly, his thoughts blending with the swirls of paint, each stroke an act of defiance against the rejection he had faced. But as the days passed, the sting of Victor's mockery continued to haunt him. Every time he saw a new painting come out of his hands, it wasn't just a creation, it was a challenge, a defiant statement that begged the question, would this art be enough? Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. It was a cold Friday night, and Elijah had just finished working on a new piece that felt different from the others. Elijah's heart swelled with pride. This was what he had been waiting for, someone who understood the power of his art, someone who saw beyond the surface and recognized the depth of the story he was telling. Roland didn't mock him, didn't dismiss his work as niche or irrelevant. Instead, he celebrated it. Before they parted ways, Roland offered to buy several pieces from Elijah's collection, including The Woman in the Storm. The sale was not just lucrative, it was a testament to the value of Elijah's vision, to the years of hard work and heartache that had finally borne fruit. As Elijah walked out of Roland's gallery that evening, his mind was buzzing with excitement. The validation he had craved for so long was finally his, and the journey he had started was only just beginning. But even as he reveled in the triumph of this breakthrough, the memory of Victor Leclerc's mocking words lingered in the back of his mind. He hadn't forgotten what Victor had said about his art, how it was too personal, too rooted in his background, and how no one would ever buy it. But now, Elijah had proof that his work was valuable. He had proof that someone who truly understood art, saw its worth. And he couldn't wait to show Victor just how wrong he had been. The path to success was never easy, but Elijah was learning that resilience and belief in oneself could turn the greatest mockeries into the most powerful triumphs. T wasn't just Roland Masters who had fallen in love with his work. His art, through a series of fortunate events, was spreading like wildfire. What had begun as a small breakthrough, the sale of a few pieces to a private collector, soon spiraled into something larger. Articles began popping up online, written by critics and bloggers who had discovered his work on the collector's private website. Word of mouth spread quickly among the art community, and soon, there were rumors about his paintings being sought after by influential buyers across the globe. Elijah had spent the past few days trying to adjust to his newfound recognition. It was overwhelming, to say the least. His studio was flooded with requests for commissions, and his social media presence exploded with messages from collectors, art lovers, and even other artists. His phone was constantly buzzing with inquiries, but it wasn't the messages themselves that left Elijah feeling unsettled, it was the way the world had suddenly shifted. For so long, he had toiled in obscurity, waiting for the chance to prove his worth. Now, it seemed as though the world was rushing toward him with open arms, as though his art had finally found its place in the sun. But even as he reveled in this success, Elijah knew that there was still a long road ahead. Fame, after all, was fleeting. The art world could be fickle, and its appreciation of an artist was often as short-lived as a passing trend. He had seen it happen before, artists who were celebrated one moment and forgotten the next. The real question, Elijah told himself, was whether his success would endure. He wasn't interested in just being a flash in the pan. He wanted his work to last, to stand as a testament to the power of his vision. And so, he kept painting. Late into the evenings, Elijah worked in his studio, creating new pieces that reflected his evolving thoughts, new themes, and deeper explorations of identity, culture, and history. But as much as he loved the process, there was one thing that still gnawed at him, the absence of true recognition in the established art world. Despite his growing success, there remained a constant reminder of the galleries, critics, and gatekeepers who had dismissed him. They hadn't seen the value in his work back then, and while things were changing now, he couldn't help but wonder, were they paying attention? It wasn't until a few weeks later that Elijah's suspicions were confirmed. The phone rang early one morning, interrupting his quiet routine. When he answered, the voice on the other end was instantly recognizable. It was Roland Masters. "Good morning, Elijah. I hope you're well," Roland greeted him warmly. "I'm doing great, thanks for asking," Elijah responded, his heart already beginning to race. There was something in Roland's tone, something anticipatory. He could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. "I've been keeping an eye on your recent work and the buzz around it. I'm not surprised that it's taken off. What you're doing is remarkable, and it's definitely catching the attention of people who matter," Roland continued, pausing for a moment before adding, "In fact, I've been hearing rumors that some of the big galleries in town are starting to notice you as well." Elijah's pulse quickened. Big galleries? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He knew that if one of the established institutions took him in, it would solidify his place in the art world. But he also knew the price of that acceptance. He had seen how these galleries operated, how they often swallowed artists whole, bending them to the will of the market. He had to be careful. He didn't want to lose his soul in the process. "Are you talking about the Leclerc Gallery?" Elijah asked, unable to keep the skepticism from creeping into his voice. The mention of the Leclerc Gallery was like a reminder of his past rejection, the pain of Victor's mockery still fresh in his mind. yes, in fact, they'd been looking at your work. Victor Leclerc himself reached out to me recently, Roland said, his voice careful. He's aware of the rise in demand for your pieces, and he's very interested in representing you. He wants to meet. Elijah felt a strange knot twist in his stomach. Victor Leclerc, the man who had scoffed at him, mocked him for being too niche, now wanted to meet. The irony was almost too much to bear. The man who had dismissed him, who had called his work too personal, was now reaching out because he had seen its value. It felt like a cruel joke. I see, Elijah said, trying to keep his tone neutral, but inside, his thoughts were in turmoil. How could I even consider working with someone like him? Victor had made it clear that Elijah's background, his identity, had no place in the art world. He had told him, in no uncertain terms, that no one would buy his work. And now, the same man wanted to be part of his success? Elijah could feel the anger rising within him, but he tamped it down. This wasn't the time for emotion, it was time for strategy. I'm sure Victor's reaching out with a very generous offer, Roland continued. But, Elijah, I want you to think carefully. There's no denying that working with him could elevate your profile exponentially. You'd have access to a wider audience, and it could lead to even bigger opportunities. Elijah paused, staring out the window of his studio. The city below was buzzing with life, but in that moment, it felt distant, as though he were seeing it from another world. Roland was right in one sense, working with a gallery like Leclerc's would catapult him into a different league. It would bring his art to the forefront of the commercial art world, where it could reach more collectors, more buyers, more recognition. It would be everything he had dreamed of. But the more Elijah thought about it, the more he realized that it was also a step toward losing what made his art unique, his voice, his identity. The entire reason he had turned down the conventional path, the reason he had fought so hard to carve out his own space, was because he didn't want to be part of that world. He didn't want to be another artist who conformed to the market's whims, who diluted his message for the sake of sales. I'll think about it, Elijah said finally, his voice calm. But I need some time. I have to make the right decision. Roland agreed to give him space to think, but as the call ended, Elijah was left with more questions than answers. His success had come at a price, he was now at a crossroads, caught between the world that had rejected him and the one that was now knocking on his door. Over the next few days, Elijah continued to receive offers from other buyers and art dealers, all of whom praised his work, but it was Victor's offer that hung over him like a shadow. He spent countless hours contemplating his next move. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what kind of artist he wanted to be. The choice before him was simple, but the stakes were high. Would he accept the validation that came from working with a gallery that had once rejected him, or would he continue on his own, carving his own path, no matter how difficult it was? Elijah knew one thing for sure, he was no longer the same person who had walked into the Leclerc gallery months ago, desperate for validation. The world had seen his work. The world had embraced it. And now, it was up to him to decide how far he was willing to go to keep his integrity intact. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Elijah's decision loomed over him like a heavy cloud, pressing on his thoughts, his creativity, and his every waking moment. He'd tried to throw himself into his art, to drown out the noise of the outside world, but it wasn't working. Every brushstroke felt laden with uncertainty. He was creating, yes, but it wasn't the same. The joy of painting had become tainted by the looming question, what now? In the midst of this internal struggle, things were changing in the art world. The news that his paintings were fetching high prices and becoming the subject of intense interest had spread quickly. What had started as a buzz among collectors had turned into a frenzy. The media began to take notice, and soon, articles were appearing in respected art magazines and blogs about his rise from obscurity. He was described as a visionary and a game-changer, phrases that sounded almost surreal to his ears. But what struck Elijah most was the attention from the very galleries that had once turned him away. Victor Leclerc, the man who had dismissed him with cruel words, was now desperately trying to get in touch with him. Elijah had received numerous calls from Victor's office, but he hadn't responded. He had no interest in meeting with someone who had shown him nothing but disdain. But it wasn't just Victor. The art world, once so indifferent to his work, was now beating a path to his door. Buyers were clamoring for his pieces, and big names in the industry were calling in favors to get a chance to purchase one of his works. And yet, in the midst of it all, Elijah remained steadfast in his resolve to maintain control over his career. He was determined not to be swept up in the frenzy of fame, not to lose the heart of what made his art unique. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Elijah learned the true extent of the struggle facing Victor's gallery. The news came by way of an article in Art World Weekly, a publication that had once ignored his work but now found itself reporting on the chaos engulfing the Leclerc gallery. Victor's business was hemorrhaging money, his reputation tarnished by a series of poor decisions, including the acquisition of overpriced and unsellable artworks. It was no surprise, really. Leclerc's gallery had always been a symbol of elitism and exclusivity, focusing on high-profile artists whose works catered to the tastes of the ultra-wealthy. But now, with his gallery's future on the line, Victor was in a desperate scramble to save face and his business. Elijah felt a cold, detached sense of vindication as he read the article. He'd known that the art world was precarious, but he hadn't fully realized how fragile the empire built by men like Victor really was. It was ironic, in a way. Victor had looked down on him, belittled him, convinced that his work didn't fit into the world of high art. But now, as the market was shifting, it was clear that his dismissive attitude had been a fatal flaw. The very success he had rejected was now the thing that could have saved his gallery. Days later, Elijah received a message from Victor himself, this time personal and not through his assistant. The email was short but urgent, pleading for a meeting. Elijah, I know I've made mistakes. I didn't understand the value of your art when we first met, and for that, I deeply regret it. My gallery is facing dire straits, and I'm hoping you might be willing to discuss working together. Please, I'd like the chance to make things right. At first, Elijah was tempted to ignore the message. He didn't need Victor's approval anymore, and the idea of sitting across from the man who had mocked him for so long felt like an exercise in futility. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the realization that, despite his success, something about this situation felt incomplete. There was something satisfying about the idea of confronting Victor, of making him understand just how wrong he had been. After several days of careful thought, Elijah finally decided to meet. But he knew this wouldn't be a meeting about business, it would be about something much deeper. He had something to prove, not to Victor, but to himself. He needed to see for himself if he could hold on to his integrity in a world that was constantly trying to pull him in different directions. The meeting was set for a Monday afternoon, in the very same Leclerc gallery where Elijah had first been rejected. As he walked through the doors of the gallery once again, he couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. The place still carried the air of exclusivity and cold professionalism, but it was no longer intimidating. This was a space that had once been hostile to his presence, but now, with every step he took, Elijah felt a new kind of strength. He wasn't the same artist who had walked in months ago, full of hope and uncertainty. He had grown. His work had grown. And most importantly, he had proven that he could succeed without the approval of people like Victor. Victor Leclerc was waiting for him in his office, a small, sparsely decorated room with large windows that overlooked the city. When he saw Elijah walk through the door, he stood up from his desk, his posture stiff but respectful. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, but there was something different in his demeanor now, something that hinted at vulnerability. The arrogance that had once marked his every movement was now gone, replaced with something far less certain. Elijah, Victor said, his voice softer than Elijah had ever heard it. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this isn't easy, and I can't tell you how much I regret my previous actions. I was wrong. Your work is groundbreaking, and I didn't see that at the time. I should have believed in you. Elijah didn't immediately respond. He had to resist the urge to let his emotions take over. He'd come here to make his point, not to bask in Victor's contrition. The time for apologies had passed. Instead, he studied Victor, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man's discomfort. "You should have," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But you didn't. You looked at my work and saw nothing but an opportunity to reinforce your preconceived ideas about what art should be. You didn't see me. You didn't see what my art means." Victor swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of Elijah's words had crushed him, but then he looked up again, meeting Elijah's gaze. "I know," Victor said, his voice thick with regret. "And I'm asking for the chance to make it right. I want to represent your work now. I've learned my lesson, and I can see the value in what you do. I've seen the demand for your art, and I believe your work belongs in the gallery, my gallery." Elijah took a deep breath, letting the moment hang between them. He could feel the power in his position. Victor needed him now. The tables had turned, and it was up to Elijah how this would unfold. But instead of jumping at the offer, Elijah felt a moment of clarity. He wasn't looking for validation from Victor anymore. He didn't need a gallery that had once rejected him. What he needed was to build something on his own, something that would honor his vision without compromise. "I appreciate your honesty, Victor," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "But I'm not sure your gallery is the right place for me. My work is about more than just selling to the highest bidder. It's about telling a story that's bigger than just me. And I think I need to take it in a different direction." Victor stared at him, the realization hitting him like a blow. "You're not going to work with me?" Elijah shook his head. "No. I'm not. But I'm going to keep creating. And I'll find my place in this world without you." The finality in Elijah's words hung in the air. It was a turning point, not just for him, but for Victor, too. Victor sat back in his chair, silently processing Elijah's decision. There were no more words, no more negotiations. Elijah had made his stand. And now, as he walked out of the Leclerc gallery, he felt the weight of his choices lifting, replaced with a sense of freedom. He didn't need validation from the old guard. He had built his own path. And it was only just beginning. The phone rang one crisp morning, the kind of morning when the world seemed to move at a slower pace, as if taking a deep breath before the hustle of the day began. Elijah had just finished a painting, a piece that had been simmering in his mind for weeks, and was about to step back and assess his work when his phone lit up with a call from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment. It had become a common occurrence recently for unknown numbers to reach out, many from collectors or agents. But something told him that today's call was different. "Hello?" Elijah answered, his voice steady. "Elijah," came a deep, familiar voice. "It's Roland Masters." Elijah sat up straighter at the sound of Roland's name. Roland, the art critic and collector who had championed him early on, had been instrumental in spreading the word about his work. He'd been one of the few to see the value in his art when most others had dismissed it. But Elijah knew that Roland's call today was not just about his usual praise. "What's going on, Roland?" Elijah asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, but sensing the tension in the air. "There's something I think you need to know," Roland began, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. "I've been hearing rumors that Victor Leclerc is in talks with several potential investors. He's looking to sell his gallery. Word on the street is that he's in trouble." Elijah felt a sudden jolt. Victor's gallery is in trouble? The thought seemed almost too poetic, too fitting. It was as though the universe was finally balancing the scales, punishing Victor for his arrogance. Elijah had known the art world was a fickle place, but seeing the mighty fall like this felt almost too satisfying. "Why are you telling me this?" Elijah asked, even though he had an inkling of where the conversation was headed. Roland let out a small sigh, the kind that signified the weight of a bigger truth. "I'm not sure you realize just how much influence you have right now. You've become a major figure in the art world, Elijah. There are people watching you, people who see your potential far beyond what any gallery could offer you. Some of them are interested in buying into Leclerc's business. And, well, he paused for a moment, allowing the implication to settle in. One of those people is you. Elijah's mind began to race. The words felt surreal. Buy into Leclerc's business? He had spent so many months contemplating his place in the art world, wondering if he was destined to be another overlooked artist, discarded by the very people who were supposed to elevate him. But now, after everything that had happened, the rejection, the vindication, the success, he was staring at an entirely new possibility. He could buy into a gallery. Not just any gallery, but the very one that had once rejected him. I'm not following, Roland, Elijah said, his voice shaky with a mix of disbelief and intrigue. Are you suggesting I buy the Leclerc gallery? I'm saying that there's an opportunity here, Roland replied, his tone deliberate. You have the funds, the credibility, and the power now. If you act fast, you could buy Victor out of his failing business. You'd own the gallery. You'd be in control. The thought hung in the air like a spark. Elijah felt the weight of it settle deep within him. The offer wasn't just about ownership, it was about transformation. This wasn't about simply taking control of a business, it was about redefining what a gallery could be. Victor Leclerc had always represented the old guard, a gatekeeper of an elitist art world that Elijah had never wanted to be a part of. But what if, in owning that space, he could change the narrative entirely? What if he could turn Leclerc's exclusive, elitist gallery into something entirely different, something that welcomed artists of all backgrounds, that celebrated diversity, that gave a platform to voices that had always been silenced? For the first time, Elijah saw a way to truly make his mark, not just as an artist, but as a leader in the art world. I'll need time to think about it, Elijah said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. He could almost hear Roland smile through the phone. Take all the time you need, Elijah. But remember, this could be the moment you've been waiting for. It's a chance to show the world that things can be done differently. The line went quiet for a moment, and Elijah sat back, processing Roland's words. The idea of buying into the gallery was still surreal, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It was an opportunity not just to make money, but to make a statement. The art world was changing, and now, with the power in his hands, he could help lead that change. The next few days were a blur. Elijah spoke to his financial advisors, his lawyer, and trusted friends, trying to figure out the logistics of such a monumental decision. He learned that Victor was indeed desperate to sell, eager to offload the business, before it collapsed entirely. The terms of the sale were steep, but Elijah was in a position to make it work. It was a bold move, one that would solidify his place in the art world, but it was also a deeply personal one. This wasn't just about buying a business, it was about taking control of a narrative that had been written for him by others. It was a Monday when Elijah called Victor Leclerc's office to set up the meeting. The moment had arrived. The gallery was empty when he arrived, save for a few staff members and a few lingering pieces of art from the last exhibition. It was a ghost of the place it once had been, a stark contrast to the bustling, high-end space it had once represented. Victor was waiting for him in the same office Elijah had sat in months ago, but this time, the tension between them was different. Gone was the arrogance, the dismissive attitude. In its place was an almost desperate air of quiet defeat. Victor stood when Elijah entered, his face strained but polite. There was no longer any pretense of superiority. Elijah, Victor said, his voice tinged with a mixture of regret and hope. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you to be the one standing here, ready to take over my business. Elijah looked at Victor, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent months thinking about this very moment, the moment when he would stand before the man who had once ridiculed him, who had doubted him. And now, here he was, the one in control. I'm not here to gloat, Victor, Elijah said, his tone measured but firm. I'm here because I believe in the art. I believe in the potential of this space. And I'm ready to take it in a new direction. Victor looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he nodded slowly. I never imagined this would happen. But I suppose you've earned it. You've proven me wrong, Elijah. I only wish I had seen it sooner. With that, the deal was made. Elijah became the new owner of the Leclerc Gallery. The moment felt surreal. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for every artist who had been overlooked, every voice that had been dismissed in favor of the elite few. Elijah stood in the center of the gallery, taking it all in. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a force for change. And this was only the beginning. The days following the signing of the contract felt like a blur of endless paperwork, phone calls, and meetings with his new team. Elijah found himself on a whirlwind tour of what had once been Victor Leclerc's exclusive art empire, a series of spaces filled with high-end, but impersonal works. It was a strange thing, taking ownership of a place that had been the very symbol of elitism and exclusion. It felt like reclaiming something that had always belonged to him, but had been denied. He wasn't just investing in property, he was investing in a new kind of future, one that was far more inclusive, far more open, and far more welcoming to every artist, regardless of background or financial status. But despite the excitement of his new venture, there was still one moment Elijah had been dreading, the moment when he would finally face Victor, the man who had turned him away, ridiculed him, and dismissed his art as unworthy. Elijah had no intention of letting the past fester. He needed to confront Victor, not just for his own closure, but for the larger message it would send. The art world had a long history of gatekeeping, of maintaining a status quo that favored a select few. Elijah wasn't just going to slip quietly into the role of gallery owner. He was going to make sure that people like Victor were held accountable for their actions. The day came sooner than Elijah had expected. After a series of introductory meetings with his new staff and several announcements regarding the gallery's future direction, he arranged to meet Victor in the very same office where they'd once sat. This time, however, the stakes were different. The roles had reversed. Elijah was no longer the artist seeking validation. He was the one in control. And Victor, for the first time, was the one on the defensive. Victor was already seated at the desk when Elijah arrived, a faint sense of unease hanging in the air. There were no grand gestures this time, no smug arrogance. His posture was slumped, his eyes distant, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to come. "Elijah," Victor said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't expect you to come here so soon. But I suppose I owe you some kind of explanation for the way things went down between us." Elijah stepped into the room, his gaze cool but unwavering. He could feel the weight of the situation, the tension, the history, the bitterness that had colored their previous interactions. There was a part of him that had fantasized about this moment, the moment when he would get to confront Victor, to show him how far he had come. But now that he was here, standing in front of the man who had once ridiculed him, Elijah realized there was no satisfaction to be found in revenge. This wasn't about retribution. This was about something much deeper. It was about truth. "I don't need an apology from you, Victor," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "What I need is for you to understand why your actions were wrong. Not just to me, but to all the artists you rejected, to the ones you dismissed because they didn't fit your narrow view of what art should be." Victor looked down, clearly struggling with the weight of Elijah's words. For the first time in their dealings, there was no defensiveness, no excuse. There was only a man facing the consequences of his actions, and it was a humbling sight to behold. "You were right," Victor said finally, his voice thick with regret. "I was wrong. I made assumptions about your art before I even understood it. I didn't see the value in it, and I rejected you because I couldn't see past my own narrow perspective. I was wrong to treat you like that." Elijah didn't rush to respond. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them settle between them. Victor's apology, though genuine, felt insufficient. It wasn't enough to just admit he was wrong. What Elijah needed was for Victor to truly understand the harm that his actions had caused, to understand how many other artists had been held back by the same elitism and prejudice that had poisoned his view of Elijah's work. "You rejected me because you thought I wasn't worthy of your gallery," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. "You rejected me because my art didn't fit into the box you wanted it to fit into. But what you didn't realize is that art is not about fitting into a box. It's about breaking down those walls, about challenging the status quo, about telling stories that people need to hear, even if they make you uncomfortable. Victor didn't speak right away. He just sat there, his eyes now filled with something that resembled understanding, regret, yes, but also something more. The realization that his arrogance, his assumption of control, had led him down a path of failure. I was so focused on the market, Victor admitted quietly. On what people wanted to buy, what would sell for the most. I didn't understand that art is not just about making money, it's about making a statement. It's about pushing boundaries. Elijah nodded slowly. Exactly. And that's what I'm trying to do now. This gallery, it's not just about creating a space for high-end buyers. It's about creating a space for artists to be themselves, for their voices to be heard, without being judged based on where they come from or what they look like. It's about making sure that people like me, people who were told they weren't good enough, weren't worthy enough, have the chance to show the world what they're capable of. Victor looked at him, and for the first time Elijah saw something like genuine admiration in his eyes. It wasn't the same admiration he had once given to the high-profile artists in his gallery, but something different, something earned. Elijah wasn't just another artist seeking validation. He had done what Victor had failed to do, he had pushed past the barriers that Victor had built. And in doing so, Elijah had created something that was bigger than any gallery, any artist, or any institution. You've changed the game, Victor said quietly, as if coming to terms with the truth. And I see that now. I see what you're doing with this gallery, with your art. You're not just creating. You're redefining what art can be. Elijah met Victor's gaze with calm resolve. And I'm not going to stop. The art world needs to change. And I'll do everything I can to make sure it does. For a long moment, the two men sat in silence. The past couldn't be erased. It couldn't be forgotten. But there was something about this moment, this confrontation, that felt like a release. The old guard, represented by Victor, was fading. In its place, something new, something more inclusive, was rising. Elijah wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a leader, a catalyst for change. Victor stood up slowly, as if sensing the finality of the conversation. He extended his hand, and Elijah shook it firmly. There were no more words to be said. The chapter had closed. And Elijah, with his newfound power and influence, was ready to begin writing the next one. As he left Victor's office, Elijah knew that his journey was far from over. The art world still had many walls to break, many voices to lift. But today, he had taken a step that could change everything. The future of art, and the gallery he now owned, was in his hands. And for the first time, Elijah felt truly free. The days following Elijah's confrontation with Victor Leclerc felt like a dream. The gallery was now his, and with that ownership came a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about running a business, this was about shaping the future of the art world. Elijah had never been content with the status quo, and now, with all the power in his hands, he had the chance to build something that would reflect his vision, a vision where art was for everyone, not just the select few. Elijah spent the first few weeks in meetings with his team, carefully selecting new curators, artists, and advisors who shared his values. He wanted the gallery to be a place where diversity wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. He knew there were talented artists from all backgrounds who had been ignored, pushed aside, and denied opportunities simply because they didn't fit into the narrow definition of what art should be. Now, it was his mission to change that. The gallery's name would remain Leclerc Gallery for now, but the changes Elijah was implementing were anything but superficial. The walls, once adorned with the kinds of high-priced, corporate-approved art that had dominated the scene for decades, were slowly being replaced with pieces that told stories, stories of struggle, identity, resilience, and triumph. Artists of every race, gender, and socioeconomic background were invited to showcase their work, each piece reflecting the vibrant tapestry of human experience. And through it all, Elijah ensured that every artist was compensated fairly, something Victor Leclerc had never considered in his pursuit of profit. But the transformation didn't end with the artwork. Elijah knew that if the gallery was to truly reflect the values he held dear, the space itself had to feel different. Gone were the cold, sterile walls that felt more like a museum than a place of artistic expression. In their place were warm, welcoming spaces with open seating areas, exhibition rooms flooded with natural light, and interactive displays where visitors could engage with the artists and their work. The gallery wasn't just a place to look at art, it was a place to experience it, to feel it, to understand it. One of the first exhibitions Elijah organized was called Voices Unheard. It was a celebration of marginalized artists, from Black creators like himself to women artists, LGBTQ+ voices, and indigenous creators who had long been ignored by the mainstream art world. The opening night was nothing short of magical. The gallery was packed with people from all walks of life, artists, collectors, critics, and art lovers, each person eager to experience the raw, authentic stories being told through the art on display. As Elijah walked through the gallery that night, watching people interact with the pieces, listening to the way they discussed the art, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The energy in the space was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was electric, alive with possibility. For the first time, the art world felt like it was opening its doors to everyone, not just the wealthy few, but to anyone who had something to say. The shift was palpable, and it was clear that Elijah was at the center of it all. His gallery wasn't just a place for artists to showcase their work, it was a platform for voices that had been silenced for too long. But the success of Voices Unheard was not without its challenges. As the gallery grew in prominence, Elijah faced pushback from old guard collectors and critics who didn't like what he was doing. They didn't like the way he was shaking things up, the way he was making art more accessible, more democratic. They didn't like that the gallery was challenging the hierarchy they had spent years building. There were whispers behind his back, murmurs of doubt, and even outright hostility from certain quarters. Yet Elijah remained resolute. He had always known that change came with resistance. He had felt it before, when he was rejected by Victor, and he felt it now. But he refused to let the opposition deter him. He knew that what he was doing was right, that the art world needed this shift. It needed new voices, new perspectives, and new stories. And he was going to fight for them, no matter the cost. As the months went by, the gallery's reputation continued to grow. More artists began to take notice, and more collectors, those who had once shunned him, began to realize that Elijah was onto something. The work being displayed at the gallery wasn't just valuable in a financial sense, it was valuable in a cultural sense. The art spoke to people, it moved them, it challenged them to think differently. And slowly, the gallery began to attract not just buyers, but true art lovers, people who came to appreciate the deeper meanings behind the pieces, who understood that art was more than just a commodity to be bought and sold. One day, several months after the gallery's relaunch, Elijah received a message that he would never forget. It was from an art collector who had once laughed at him, who had dismissed his work and his ideas. The message read, "I've seen the incredible transformation you've made with Leclerc Gallery. The work you're showcasing is groundbreaking. I'd like to discuss a partnership." Elijah stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words sink in. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was the same person who had once turned their back on him, who had dismissed the very art that was now revolutionizing the industry. And yet, here they were, acknowledging the very thing they had once rejected. He could have easily ignored the message, could have taken satisfaction in their sudden interest. But instead, he responded with a simple reply. "Thank you for your message. Let's meet. I believe there's much we can discuss." That meeting, when it happened, was a turning point. The collector, once a firm believer in the exclusivity of art, now saw things differently. They understood that art wasn't about maintaining an elite circle, it was about connecting with people, about telling stories that mattered, that transcended wealth and status. They saw that Elijah's vision was something the art world needed, and they wanted to be a part of it. By the end of their meeting, Elijah had secured a partnership that would allow the gallery to expand even further. It was a partnership built not just on financial gain, but on a shared belief in the power of art to change the world. And as Elijah shook hands with the collector, he knew that he had not only transformed the gallery, but had helped transform the very art world itself. The grand opening of the new expansion was nothing short of spectacular. It was the culmination of everything Elijah had worked for, the inclusive, diverse, and vibrant art space that he had envisioned from the very beginning. The gallery was no longer just a place for artists to sell their work, it was a community, a movement. It was a space where art truly had the power to bring people together, to heal wounds, to provoke thought, and to ignite change. As the opening night drew to a close, Elijah stood at the center of the gallery, surrounded by the art he had always believed in, the art that had once been rejected and now found its rightful place in the world. The gallery was a reflection of his journey, the struggles, the victories, the moments of doubt, and the moments of triumph. But most importantly, it was a testament to the fact that resilience, talent, and vision could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Elijah looked around at the people gathered in the gallery, artists, collectors, critics, and visitors, and felt a profound sense of pride. The world had changed, and he had played a part in that change. This was his new chapter, and it was only the beginning. The future of art was no longer defined by the old guard. It was defined by voices that had been ignored, by stories that had been silenced, and by the courage to push beyond what was comfortable and into what was truly transformative. Elijah had built something lasting, something that would endure long after the gallery doors closed for the night. And as he stood there, watching the world around him, Elijah knew one thing for certain: the fight had been worth it.